Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Hydrogen Rising. I'm Sandy Safro, and I'll be your host for today's episode, which is going to be a little bit different than our episodes to date for two main reasons. First, I'm joined by my co-host, David Wochner, who's going to be sharing the mic with me as host today.
Hey, Sandy.
Hey, David. How are you? Good to see you.
Yeah, great.
And then second, we have a special guest on today's episode.
That's right, Sandy. We're very excited to have Alex Klaessig joining us today from IHS Markit, one of the world's leading energy consultancies, which combines information, analytics, and expertise to provide solutions for business and finance. Alex serves as Director of Gas Power and Energy Futures and co-chairs the IHS Markit Energy Innovation Pioneers Program and has been instrumental in several key market studies, including hydrogen in the Golden State. So very relevant for our discussion today. Alex, welcome to you. We're very excited to have you today on the podcast. And I think what we'd like to talk about today is exploring a bit the color nomenclature for hydrogen. I think something that Sandy and I over the last year and a half have been interested in and debating and learning and kind of understanding the rainbow, and really hope to hear from you some of your thoughts on potential benefits and limitations.
Great. Well, David, Sandra, thanks so much for having me. So there's a little bit of, controversy around the colors for hydrogen, and it's because the colors themselves don't really fit any clear cookie-cutter definitions. So I guess I'll walk you through four of the most common colors that I come across, and I'll give you the general buckets for them, and then we can talk about, some of the taxonomies that I prefer a little bit more so than the colors.
Perfect.
Great. So when we talk about colors, the one that everyone seems to agree on is green, and green is going to be low carbon hydrogen, primarily from renewables, where you would take renewable electricity and you pair it with an electrolyzer to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And that can be, zero or maybe even, very low carbon. And then there's this gray area inside of the green where, you might be able to take biological sources of natural gas, things like anaerobic digested manure, and take the resulting methane from it and split that into its composites of hydrogen and carbon. And so that is the first little gray area that you run into. And then the second type of hydrogen that everyone seems to agree on is blue. And this is going to be generally considered natural gas reformed hydrogen with a carbon capture and sequestration unit attached to it. Though there are some that would, say that blue really means anything made from natural gas, because in Europe, there is an incredible amount of branding that has gone along with making natural gas considered the blue energy source. Gray would be fossil fuels that are not using carbon capture and sequestration systems to make them low carbon. You could consider them unabated, I guess. And this is primarily where 95, 96% of the world's current hydrogen production lies, inside of that gray bucket. And then we get to a lot of fun colors, right? So ones that I run across are like yellow, which would be electrolysis with nuclear. And then there's turquoise, which is, bubbling natural gas through a vat of molten lead or tin in order to get a hydrogen off gas and a solid carbon sequestrable product. But really, this is where the color schemes really start to fall apart. So those are, four basic categories.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
Yes.
David?
No,
I think we're both so excited about this.
Not lost, I think, on listeners is going to be that right at the outset, as you talk about green, and you kind of noted that everyone agrees that green is obviously kind of the objective, right, to be reducing emissions. But you noted that even within green, there's a gray area, right? Not to be confused with your later category of gray hydrogen. Mm-hmm. I guess maybe because the use of these terms is pretty ubiquitous, or at least becoming ubiquitous. Before we kind of pick them apart, what's your thought on some of the benefits? I mean, it strikes me that, and particularly, I suppose, working with policymakers and regulators in Washington, D.C., for example, they often need things distilled down quite simply, right? That you can say this is green, and as a result, green is what we're striving for, or blue because it includes carbon capture. So what are the benefits to the color profiles as you see it?
Well, as much as I disparage them, they do provide a lot of information with, relatively limited amounts of, adjectives. So when you hear the words green, you immediately are thinking, it's low carbon, it's probably using renewable electricity sources. And, people are drawn to these types of, very intuitive and simple concepts, right? And so it makes it very palatable in that regard. And, we were talking about policymakers and, living in that regulated universe. And, we see in the political spectrum the use of colors all the time. There's reds and there's blues. And if you're in, Eastern Europe, there might be orange revolutions and things like that. So, they give people a sense of what is at stake or what the issue is, and also, a little bit of branding along with them. So there is some value to them, and they make the conversation an easy starting point, I guess.
I think that's a really helpful explanation, and it kind of leads a little bit into one of the questions that I have, and David's heard me talk about this a bunch, but I really start to think about how the hydrogen economy is going to develop and the various methods that we will be using to transport hydrogen, not just in interstate commerce in the United States, but also hopefully eventually internationally as a global market develops. And some of the methods of transportation themselves and some of the types of methodologies that have to be employed to accomplish that transportation require a significant amount of energy themselves. For example, on our episode last week, or on our last episode, we were talking about LH2 and the significant amount of energy that's required to convert hydrogen into a liquid and to maintain it in that liquid state. And as I think about that, I really start to wonder what happens to the colors. Are we using the colors just to describe the pathway for production, or should the colors also include some accounting for the amount of energy required to accomplish transportation and distribution of hydrogen? And so just kind of curious for your thoughts on that.
So this is where I think places like California's low carbon fuel standard are excellent, because for every delivery mechanism that includes the production pathway, they've come up with a carbon intensity of the fuel, which includes, hydrogen and all sorts of other fun things like renewable natural gas. And so they are very cognizant of how these colors might be considered mixed at the final endpoint. And so, if I could have my way, we would move away from, the color discussion, and we would move towards this carbon intensity discussion, because as we move forward in time, it's not going to be all just one production source, right? We see in California right now, they have this hydrogen refueling infrastructure credit, and in the credit, you need to have, I think it's about 33% green hydrogen or low carbon electrolytic hydrogen in the station in order to get funding. And so you've already started mixing greens and blues, right? And so you could have like a greenish blue or turquoise or whatever. But I think that the colors as they stand very much have to be thought about as the wholesale production facility. And once you get downstream, everything's probably brown.
Interesting that last point. And it strikes me, one of the things that I think we can draw on, Sandy mentioned the last podcast episode talking about LH2, and part of that was talking to our colleagues who have decades of experience in the liquefied natural gas sector, LNG. And of course, we are seeing a movement now in LNG offtake contracts globally to begin to quantify carbon emissions, right? So that it's no longer this has been a trend line over the last few years, particularly in the U.S., as the U.S. has taken on a key export role with regard to LNG, that the off-takers now, who are also trying to meet their Paris climate agreements or requirements, are having a conversation with the LNG exporters saying, what is the carbon profile of the project, of the upstream production, of the transport? And so that conversation, as we think about moving to another commodity, moving to hydrogen, it seems to me that some of the answer, Alex, could be that shorthand kind of color nomenclature will remain in use in certain circumstances, whether it's with policymakers or the like. But when you get down to it, the actual transactions, the actual work to develop the hydrogen economy, you're going to start seeing that your whole point about the carbon intensity showing up in commercial contracts and kind of as a fundamental part of the business that people are engaging in, whether it's to build facilities, whether it's to purchase the commodity, whether it's to transport the commodity. So it almost strikes me that you could have kind of two parallel paths, right? That the carbon intensity at the detail level becomes quite relevant, but there still is kind of this broader nomenclature. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. So, corporate procurement of low carbon energy is one of the tips of the spear for the renewables industry, and it's very interesting to see it starting to trickle into other industrial feedstocks like LNG and in the future hydrogen, once hydrogen becomes more of a marketed commodity. So I think that there very much is this element of branding and of wanting to say, hey, we're meeting our Paris climate agreements or whatever their corporate announced goals are, and that when they say, hey, we bought green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, they can again intuitively get that across to their audience that we are making strides in this direction. And then when the lawyers get all the paperwork at the end of the day, right, it's going to be, it needs to be this carbon intensity and all sorts of other codicils to make it so that it actually meets what they intended to, right?
Yeah, I think David and I are both nodding our heads that makes a lot of sense to both of us. And I think one of the maybe kind of derivatives of that question is, how does that potential for sort of two parallel paths of labeling hydrogen potentially impact the opportunity for creating global benchmarks and prices for hydrogen as the economy starts to evolve more?
Well, so, I don't want to harp on the California low carbon fuel standard versus, maybe like the renewable fuel standard, but I'll do it. So in the renewable fuel standard, you have these buckets, right? And you're either labeled, cellulosic or advanced bio, I forget exactly what that bucket is, but you have all of these random buckets, and you can have multiple fuels within the bucket, and they each have their own carbon intensity. But because you're rewarded for just being in the bucket, there is no desire or impetus to improve, right? And the California low carbon fuel standard, where you actually are remunerated for every gram of carbon that you get out of that fuel, there is a lot of incentive to innovate and to make new things that are lower carbon intensity. And so, I think the labels are great for discussion, but I would hate to see a broad-based regulatory scheme that made these broad labels and then took away people's economic motives to make things better.
So that I think really hits home, particularly for Sandy and I, given the work we do at the intersection of government and the energy industry. And, certainly for the 20 years I've been practicing what is a, consistent failure of government to have a reasoned energy policy, right, in terms of how to move forward. I'm curious about that. If again, kind of pulling on your LCFS experience and how that has played out in California, as the feds think about how to tackle this, right? I mean, we're seeing, grant dollars from DOE, right, for investment in potential opportunities. I expect that hydrogen is going to feature prominently in an infrastructure package to the extent that it moves forward in this Congress and with the Biden administration. If you had, kind of a wish list of 3 things that, in terms of the U.S., obviously focused on the U.S. government here, that the feds could do, what would those be in order to promote lower carbon intensity hydrogen?
So the first would be to move forward with the proposed RFS pathways for hydrogen so that you would be able to stack the renewable fuel standard credits with the California's low carbon fuel standard credits if you took renewable natural gas and reformed it. And so that would be something that would put more money in the pockets of farmers and would increase incentives to get hydrogen fuel out there and would make car dealers a little bit, more willing to go in the risky route of producing these cars. Another one would be inclusion or expansion of the zero emission vehicle mandates that California currently enjoys. I believe there's about 11 other states who wanted to join in on California's waiver, which was revoked by the Trump administration. If the Biden administration could reinstitute that waiver and allow those other states to employ zero-emission vehicle mandates, that would be a huge driver. And then, everyone's favorite production tax credit for hydrogen, or an investment tax credit, just tax credits. So those are my three most impactful things that this administration could do. And then longer term, it's a lot more open.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm kind of struck by the fact that heavy focus there kind of in the first 2 in particular on transportation. It is something we talk about that, there's been a lot of focus on transportation over, in recent months, because I think that's what people know and understand. But the opportunities for hydrogen, of course, are so much broader. And so PTC and ITC are fantastic ways of potentially pushing forward the hydrogen economy more broadly.
I can pick up just a little bit more on this transportation and PTC theme that you noted. So, in the transportation arena, it's very easy to electrify a lot of uses, right? For the light duty vehicle market, if you're like me, you might drive a couple of miles to work every day and then charge it at work. And if you have a garage, which I don't, maybe you could charge it there. And so there's a lot of opportunity to decarbonize the light duty vehicle fleets. But when we talk about heavy and medium duty vehicles, the opportunities for electrification really aren't there. So I went out to get a taco the other day when I was at work, and there was a taco truck downstairs, and it had a ventilation hood and a deep fat fryer and a bunch of burners and a bunch of other, equipment. And when I added up all of the power that it used, it could easily burn through 50, 60 kilowatts in an hour. And when you think about electrifying something like that, you would need to put an incredible battery on that truck. It would weigh a ton, and it would take forever to charge. And so, we need another option for the vehicle fleet if we want to have taco trucks in a decarbonized future. And then the production and investment tax credits are really aimed for industrial users, right? So there are industries like steel making that have a need for a reducing agent that they currently use natural gas for. And there really is no other thermochemical agent they can use aside from hydrogen. And so by allowing them to create hydrogen at a much lower cost, you'd be able to decarbonize very hard to decarbonize materials production like steel making. So, I think that the thing about hydrogen is that it is going to be very useful in the hardest to decarbonize areas, and that when policymakers are thinking about where can we move forward, that's what they should be thinking about. Where are the pain points and how can we ease it?
Yeah, the industrials, I think, is really the issue around industrials is well said. We have K&L Gates kind of a significant part of our firm was founded in Pittsburgh. So we have a very large client base in the heavy industrial sector. And, another interesting thing there is how do you ensure that all these industrials have access to the hydrogen? And that's something Sandy and I have been focusing on, is expanding the mobility of hydrogen. I think there's some pilot projects now in the country to begin to blend hydrogen and gas pipelines. I mean, every one of our industrial clients has, direct hookups to large interstate gas pipelines, right? And so, but all of that is going to take substantial reworking of commercial relationships and regulatory regimes and policy. So all quite interesting. Look, I mean, Alex, maybe we do a part 2 to this in a couple months. Maybe we'll get some infrastructure legislation on the Hill. We can have you back and kind of continue this conversation. Maybe we will have made progress. I'm, in the meantime, going to pull out my box of 64 Crayolas and figure out, what periwinkle, cornflower, and unmellow yellow may actually, do in the hydrogen world. But really appreciate your insights today. I think our listeners are going to appreciate them as well. Again, we are very grateful to have had Alex Klaessig from IHS Markit join us today for Hydrogen Rising. If you are a fan, please go to our podcast page, give us 5 stars, and provide us some feedback. Always happy to hear your ideas for what else you'd like to hear on the podcast. And in the meantime, we will see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks, Alex.
Pleasure was all mine.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes, and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.